A millionaire fires his maid for theft, but days later she shows up at his birthday party uninvited, takes the microphone and finally says something that leaves all the guests shocked. The main hall of the mansion sparkled like a polished gem. Crystal chandeliers hung like cascading waterfalls of light, and the walls reflected the golden decorations, creating an atmosphere of elegance and power. Ethan Bradford, at the center of it all, seemed like a modern-day king. His smile was a blend of self-assurance and studied charm, the kind he used to disarm adversaries and win over allies. At 50, he epitomized success. Guests in tuxedos and evening gowns raised their champagne flutes as he spoke with the ease of someone who knew how to command a room. Sophie Carter entered quietly, but her presence cut through the air. Dressed in a simple black dress and a coat that had seen better days, she contrasted sharply as a shadow in the luminous landscape. Few noticed her at first, but as she began to move through the hall, heads started to turn. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. "Who is she?" someone murmured. "I don't know, but she definitely wasn't invited," another voice replied. Sophie kept her gaze fixed on Ethan. The weight of years of indignation and accumulated pain seemed to propel her forward. Ethan caught sight of her midway through a sentence. His rigid posture faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. He was not a man easily intimidated. However, something about Sophie, or the way she looked at him, deeply unsettled him. "If you'll excuse me for a moment." He attempted to wrap up his speech, but Sophie was already just a few steps away from the stage. "This won't take long, Ethan," she said, her voice calm yet firm. The entire hall fell silent. The murmurs ceased and all eyes turned to her. Ethan, with a forced smile, stepped down from the stage. "Sophie," he said quietly, leaning in toward her, "I think you're in the wrong place. Why don't we talk another time?" She grasped his arm, not with force, but with a determination that made him halt. "No, Ethan, it's here and now." The tension in the hall became palpable. Sophie took the microphone still in his hand and addressed the guests. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear yet heavy with emotion. "I'm not a guest. I'm Sophie Carter, a former employee of this house." Whispers resumed among the crowd. Ethan attempted to intervene, but Sophie raised her hand. "I know many of you must be wondering why I'm here, and I promise I will explain, but first I want to tell you a story." Ethan's eyes narrowed and he stepped forward. "Sophie, this isn't the moment." "Not the moment for whom?" she retorted, staring him down. Her voice, though controlled, carried a weight that silenced any response from him. She turned back to the guests. "I worked in this house for nearly 10 years. To many of you, I'm invisible. To Ethan, I was expendable. I was accused of theft and dismissed without a chance to defend myself." A wave of shock swept through the hall. Ethan crossed his arms, a cold smile forming. "You were fired because there was clear evidence of your guilt." "Evidence?" Sophie turned to him, her eyes blazing with indignation. "I was fired because it was easier to blame someone like me than to investigate what really happened." She took a deep breath before continuing. "But that's not the most important part. I'm not here to argue about a lost bracelet. I'm here because upon leaving that door I found something you should have recognized long ago." Ethan looked increasingly uncomfortable. "What are you talking about, Sophie?" "I'm talking about the past, Ethan. About a sacrifice you ignored. About someone who gave everything so you could be here today, giving this speech in this hall." The silence that followed was absolute. Sophie looked around, allowing her words to resonate. "My mother, Elizabeth Carter, worked for you 20 years ago. She was one of the many people you hired when your company was just starting out. When things began to crumble, she was one of the few who stayed. And when no one else believed you could rise again, it was she who sacrificed everything to save you." Ethan's expression hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't know?" Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Maybe because you never bothered to ask. Maybe because you never wanted to know what happened to the people you discarded along the way." The microphone trembled in her hand, but Sophie didn't back down. "But you will know now, Ethan, and all of you will too, because her story isn't just about what she lost. It's about what you gained at her expense." She stepped back slightly, her eyes locked on him. "You can pretend you don't know, but I'm going to tell you. Not out of revenge, not to destroy you, but because the truth deserves to be heard, even if it hurts. Especially if it hurts." Ethan didn't respond. He seemed frozen, his eyes fixed on Sophie as if trying to decipher her intentions. The hall was so silent that the sound of glasses being set down on tables could be heard. "This isn't the end, Ethan," Sophie said, her gaze penetrating. "This is just the beginning." She handed the microphone back to him, but before leaving the stage, she turned to the guests one last time. "The story I came to tell isn't finished, but when I'm done, none of you will see this man the same way again." She descended calmly, leaving behind an unsettling silence. Ethan remained on stage, motionless, as the guests murmured among themselves. But something in his eyes indicated that for the first time in a long while, he had lost control of the situation. Sophie vividly remembered the smell of wax on the marble floor and the soft creaking of her soles against it as she walked through Ethan Bradford's mansion. The place felt like a monument to opulence. The walls were adorned with artworks curated by consultants, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city that made anyone feel insignificant. For Sophie, however, all of this was merely scenery, a backdrop to an exhausting routine that rarely brought satisfaction or recognition. She arrived early, usually before sunrise, to prepare the house. Every detail mattered. The towels in the bathrooms had to be perfectly aligned, the chandeliers free of any dust, and the library, Ethan's immense library, had to look untouched, even after hours of use. The work was strenuous and the rules were strict. Sophie quickly learned that any mistake, no matter how small, would be magnified in Ethan's eyes. He rarely spoke to her. Their interactions were usually short commands, delivered in a dry, almost indifferent tone. She might hear an occasional "thank you," but never a "please." To Ethan, she was just another cog in the machine that made his life run smoothly. Yet Sophie saw something beyond his mask of confidence. In the rare moments when he passed through the library without realizing she was there, his demeanor changed. He walked more slowly, his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. There was an unease about Ethan that she never managed to decipher, yet it intrigued her. The guests, on the other hand, were an entirely different story. They moved through the house as if they owned it, never acknowledging the presence of Sophie or any other staff member. There was something humiliating about being just a meter away, discreetly cleaning a table and still being treated like a ghost. "They don't even see you," she thought to herself, and it hurt more than it should have. One night, while organizing the library, Sophie was interrupted by a group of guests who entered unannounced. They laughed loudly, carrying wine glasses, and began commenting on Ethan's books. "Do you think he really read all this?" one of them said, provoking laughter. "I doubt it," replied another. "This is just to look cultured. Anyone who spends so much time making money doesn't have time to read." Sophie froze, hoping they wouldn't notice her. But eventually one of them glanced in her direction. It was a woman in a red dress that seemed ill-fitting, not physically, but as if the elegance of the outfit clashed with the malice in her eyes. "You there," she said, pointing at Sophie. "Which of these is Mr. Bradford's favorite?" Sophie hesitated, unsure if she should respond. She looked at the man who seemed to lead the group, hoping for some direction. He merely gave her a condescending smile. "She probably can't even read," he said, and everyone laughed. Sophie gritted her teeth and lowered her head, pretending to continue cleaning the table beside her. The laughter echoed in her ears like a reminder of the distance between her world and theirs. But even in that humiliation, she refused to feel small. It was in that same library that weeks later Sophie found the diary. She was organizing one of the higher shelves, using a rolling ladder to reach the volumes that were rarely touched. As she pulled a row of books to clean them, a leather-bound notebook slipped out and fell into her lap. Curious, Sophie opened the cover and saw the name written in bold letters, Elizabeth Carter. Her heart raced. That was her mother. She knew her mother had worked for Ethan many years before, but she never knew exactly what she did or why she had left the job. The only thing Elizabeth mentioned was that she had left for health reasons. The library was silent, and Sophie felt an almost irresistible urge to start reading right then. But responsibility weighed on her. There was much work to be done, and Ethan was already irritated with her for a coffee delivery that had arrived a few minutes late that morning. Later, she told herself, tucking the diary into her apron. Later that day, while adjusting flowers in the living room, Sophie heard quick, determined footsteps behind her. She turned to find Claire Montgomery, Ethan's personal assistant, with a serious expression. "Miss Carter," Claire began, her voice as sharp as her posture, "Mr. Bradford wishes to speak with you in his office." Sophie froze. There was something in Claire's tone that made her feel this was no trivial request. Leaving the flowers behind, she followed the assistant to Ethan's office. He was behind his desk, arms crossed, his face expressionless. On the desk lay the gold bracelet that one of the guests had worn the night before, the same bracelet that had caused a stir when it went missing. "Sit," Ethan said, pointing to the chair in front of him. Sophie complied, feeling the weight of his gaze. "Was it you who took this?" he asked straightforward. Sophie felt her stomach twist. "No, sir," she replied. "Then why was it in the cleaning cart you used last night?" She blinked, confused. "I don't know how it ended up there. I swear, sir, I didn't take that bracelet." Ethan studied her for a long moment, his gaze assessing. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "This isn't something I can ignore, Sophie. I can't have staff stealing from my guests." "But I didn't steal anything," Sophie protested, her voice rising unintentionally. "Someone must have put it there. I would never do something like that." "And why would someone do that?" Ethan shot back, his eyebrows raised. Sophie had no answer. All she could do was look at him, hoping he would see the truth in her eyes. But Ethan was not a man who dealt with uncertainties. "You're fired," he said dryly. Claire appeared in the doorway moments later to escort her out. Sophie left the office in a state of shock, her mind spinning with questions she couldn't answer. That night, alone in her small apartment, Sophie finally opened the diary. The first pages contained only lists of tasks and mundane reminders, but then she found something that made her stop. Today, Ethan received news that the company is on the brink of bankruptcy. He didn't say anything, but I could see the despair in his eyes. He's too proud to ask for help, so I decided to do what I can without him knowing. Maybe it will save him. Maybe not. But I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try. Sophie read that passage several times, feeling a mix of confusion and anger grow inside her. Her mother had helped Ethan in a moment of desperation, sacrificing something important, and he didn't even seem to remember it. As she continued reading, the pieces began to fit together. Elizabeth had used her savings to fund an advertising campaign that turned Ethan's company around. It was a gesture she had done silently, without expecting recognition. And somehow that same man had now fired her as if she were nothing. Sophie closed the diary, her heart heavy. It wasn't just the fact that she had been unjustly fired. It was the injustice of the entire situation, how Ethan seemed to move on, stepping on the very people who had helped him the most. She knew she needed to confront him, but how? Before we dive into the next chapter, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support is crucial for helping us grow and bring you more heartfelt stories like this one. Let's continue with the story. Sophie's small living room was a mix of organization and chaos. Despite her efforts to keep things in order, the space felt cramped, with furniture that seemed too large for the area. On the coffee table, her mother's leather-bound diary lay open, resting like a silent witness to everything that had happened that day. She had placed a cup of tea beside it, but the drink had grown cold while her attention was completely absorbed by the pages. The elegant letters of Elizabeth Carter were both familiar and distant, like a song she hadn't heard in years. Each word seemed to pulse with the presence of Elizabeth, a woman Sophie had known only partially. Now the mother she thought she understood was revealing unexpected layers of her life, layers Sophie had never imagined existed. Today was one of the hardest days. Ethan walked into the room looking burdened with anguish, yet he pretended that everything was under control. He's always trying to project strength, but I can see through that. I know he's scared. I know he's drowning. Sophie stopped reading, her gaze fixed on the sentence. The idea of her mother perceiving something so human in Ethan was unsettling. To her, Ethan Bradford was a cold and distant figure, someone who seemed untouchable, even unshakable. Yet here was Elizabeth writing about him as a vulnerable man. Returning to the text, Sophie felt as if she were entering forbidden territory, but it was irresistible. I did what I could. I used the little I had saved to launch the campaign he needed. It was risky, but I believe it will work. He will never know how much this cost me, and I prefer it that way. Sophie abruptly closed the diary, as if the words had the power to burn her. What she had just read seemed impossible. Her mother had used her savings to save Ethan. Why? She tried to imagine what her mother was thinking at that moment. Elizabeth had always been reserved, especially regarding the time she worked for Ethan. When Sophie asked about that job, her mother would respond with generic phrases, never offering many details. "What did you do, Mum?" Sophie murmured, feeling the weight of the revelation. The apartment felt even quieter as Sophie reflected. Her hands gripped the diary as if it held all the answers she needed, but she feared continuing to read. Ethan's face invaded her mind with that controlled smile and the eyes that seemed to always assess everything around him. Was he the man her mother had helped, and did he know that? She couldn't help but think about how he had treated her mother, even after everything she had done. Did he have any awareness of what Elizabeth had sacrificed for him? Or was it just another story Ethan buried under the weight of his ambition? Sophie opened the diary again, her fingers trembling. She needed to know more. I went to the doctor today. He confirmed what I already suspected. The illness is progressing faster than we expected. But I can't let this get me down. Ethan needs this campaign and I can't fail him now. After this is over, maybe I'll have time to take care of myself. The knot in Sophie's throat became almost unbearable. Her mother had postponed treatment for her own illness to help Ethan. The idea was overwhelming. With trembling hands, Sophie turned more pages. Each word was like a fragment of a memory she had never known existed, and Elizabeth Carter's image began to transform. Her mother was not just a humble worker. She was a woman who had sacrificed everything for a man who, from what Sophie could perceive, had never recognized what she had done. Sophie closed her eyes, feeling warm tears stream down her face. The pain of discovering what her mother had endured was mingled with a growing fury. She thought of Ethan's library, the way he had accused her of theft without hesitation. How could someone be so blind, so indifferent? She took a deep breath and returned to the diary. The campaign launched today. Ethan seemed lighter, but he didn't mention what I did. Maybe it's best that way. I don't do this for recognition. I do it because I believe in him. I've always believed. Sophie nearly threw the diary away. The words were a blow. Elizabeth believed in Ethan and he had ignored her. He had treated her as if she were invisible, as if her sacrifice didn't matter. She thought about confronting him right then and there, but she knew she needed something more. The diary was powerful, but she needed to fully understand the extent of what her mother had done before acting. Sophie spent the next hours reading every word. The pages revealed a story of unwavering loyalty, of a woman who saw potential in Ethan when no one else did. But they also revealed a man who seemed incapable of looking beyond himself. When Sophie finally closed the diary, the sun was beginning to rise. Exhaustion overtook her, but something else was also growing inside her. A determination that this time, Ethan could not ignore the truth. She knew her mother wouldn't have wanted revenge. Elizabeth Carter wasn't that kind of person, but Sophie also knew that the truth needed to be heard. Looking out the window, Sophie decided that somehow she would make Ethan confront what he had forgotten. Morning arrived, bringing with it the muffled sound of footsteps in the hallway of Sophie's apartment and the distant echoes of cars on the street. She sat at the table in her small kitchen, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that was cooling as quickly as her emotions boiled. In front of her, her mother's diary seemed to pulse, a presence she could hardly ignore. Everything she had read the night before danced in her mind like an uncontrollable storm. The image of her mother, always so composed and strong, had taken on another dimension. Elizabeth Carter, who seemed to accept everything with patience, had carried secrets, sacrifices, and a silent determination that Sophie had never fully understood. She gave everything for him, Sophie murmured to herself, staring at her mother's carefully written words, and he didn't even know or didn't care. Indignation boiled within her. It wasn't just her mother's sacrifice that troubled her, but the fact that Ethan had thrived on that sacrifice while people like Elizabeth and Sophie herself continued to be treated as disposable. He had accused Sophie of theft without a second thought. He hadn't even paused to consider what his family had meant to him in the past. The weight of this was overwhelming. Sophie knew that if she didn't do something, not just her own story would remain unjust, but her mother's as well. Determined, she stood up, grabbing the diary with firm hands. She didn't know exactly how, but she was going to confront Ethan Bradford. That same day, Sophie found herself standing in front of the immense mansion where she had worked for so many years. Just being there again brought a bitter taste of humiliation. She walked past the security booth with steady steps, stating that she needed to speak with Claire Montgomery. The guard hesitated, but something in Sophie's determined gaze made him allow her entry. Claire was seated in her office when Sophie was brought in, always impeccable, her hair pulled back in a bun and a perfectly tailored blazer. The assistant seemed a calculated extension of Ethan Bradford. Claire raised her eyes when Sophie entered, surprise evident on her face. "Sophie Carter," Claire said, tilting her head slightly. "This is unexpected. What can I do for you?" Sophie took a deep breath, trying to control the anger and tension swirling inside her. She couldn't lose control here. Every word had to be measured. "I came because I believe there's something you need to know," Sophie began, placing the diary on the table between them. "Something Ethan may have forgotten or ignored." Claire's eyes narrowed. She looked at the diary but didn't touch it. "What are you talking about?" "My mother, Elizabeth Carter, worked for Ethan years ago. Did you know that?" Sophie asked, her voice heavy with emotion. Claire hesitated. "Yes, I've heard of her, a dedicated employee, or so I was told. But what does that have to do with your visit?" "It has everything to do with it," Sophie replied, leaning forward. "My mother sacrificed more for Ethan than you or anyone else could imagine. She used what little she had, even postponing treatment for her own illness, to help him save the company. Without her, Ethan would never have achieved the success he has today." Claire remained immobile, her eyes fixed on Sophie. The tension in the air was palpable. "That's a very serious accusation," Claire finally said. "It's not an accusation, it's a fact," Sophie retorted, opening the diary and turning it toward Claire. "Read. It's all here. My mother's words, written with her own hands, every sacrifice she made, every pain she endured while Ethan thrived without ever looking back." Claire hesitated before taking the diary. As she read the words, her face became a mask of concentration. Sophie observed every subtle change in her expression, every nuance of surprise and discomfort that arose. When Claire finally closed the diary, she placed it back on the table carefully but didn't immediately look at Sophie. "This is moving," she said finally. "But what do you expect? What do you want me to do with this information?" "I want Ethan to know," Sophie said. "I want him to face what my mother did for him and what he did or didn't do for her in return." Claire sighed, crossing her arms. "And you think he's just going to accept that? Ethan is a complicated man, Sophie. He doesn't like being confronted, and frankly, he doesn't like being reminded of his mistakes. I'm not sure you'll get what you want." Sophie stared at her, her eyes shining with determination. "Then he will have to learn to deal with it. Because I won't stop until he knows. He can't keep pretending that people like my mother don't matter." There was a heavy silence between the two. Finally, Claire leaned back in her chair, looking at Sophie with an expression that was difficult to decipher. "There's something you should know," Claire said after a long moment. "Ethan never talks about the early days of the company. It's as if it's a chapter he wants to erase. He rarely mentions anyone who worked with him back then, including your mother." Sophie pressed her lips together, absorbing those words. This only reinforced what she had already suspected. Ethan was determined to bury the past. "Thank you for confirming what I already knew," Sophie said, rising from her seat. "But that won't stop him from hearing the truth." Claire watched her leave, but as Sophie walked out of the office, the assistant called her name. "Sophie," Claire said, hesitating, "good luck?" There was something in Claire's voice, a small crack in her professional facade, that gave Sophie pause. Perhaps, just perhaps, Claire was also tired of covering up Ethan's secrets. Sophie left the mansion feeling strengthened, but also aware that the battle was just beginning. With each step she took, her determination grew. She thought of her mother, of all the words Elizabeth had written in the diary. "He will know," Sophie murmured to herself, "and he will have to deal with it, whether he likes it or not." Sophie watched the small cafe on the corner of the street, a modest place where she had arranged to meet Teresa, an old colleague of her mother. The smell of fresh coffee wafted through the air, mixed with the muffled sound of conversations and the clinking of cups against saucers. She was still processing her conversation with Claire, but knew she needed more information before confronting Ethan directly. Teresa arrived right on time. Despite showing signs of aging, with wrinkles marking her face and hair almost completely grey, her eyes retained a lively spark. She wore a worn but clean coat and carried a bag that seemed to hold the weight of her life. Sophie stood up to greet her. "You look so much like your mother," Teresa commented, smiling warmly as she sat down. Elizabeth was an admirable woman. Sophie felt a pang in her chest at those words. "Thank you for coming. I needed to talk to someone who knew her well, who worked with her back then." Teresa nodded. "Of course, but you seem to have something specific on your mind. What's going on?" Sophie took a deep breath before responding. "I found her journal. I discovered things I had no idea about, the sacrifices she made for Ethan Bradford and the company. I want to understand what really happened." Teresa leaned forward, her expression hardening. "Ah, Ethan Bradford. I've never forgiven him for what he did to your mother, and to me, and to so many others. Elizabeth was too loyal to him. She believed he would do something great with the success, that he would give back to those who helped build the company. But he never did. He just took." Teresa's words echoed Sophie's feelings, and she clenched her hands into fists under the table. "What do you know about her sacrifices?" Teresa sighed, clearly reluctant to revisit those memories. "I know she used the money she had saved for her treatment. She never talked about it directly, but you could see it. Elizabeth was getting weaker. I asked her several times if she needed help, but she always brushed it off. She said Ethan needed all of us." Sophie felt the weight of those words hit her like a blow. Her mother had prioritized Ethan even above her own health. "What about others? My mother wasn't the only one, was she?" Teresa shook her head slowly. "No, there were others. People he manipulated, used, and then discarded. A man named Gerald, who worked in accounting, lost everything because he invested his savings in the company when Ethan asked, and Ethan never returned the money once he got rich. It's as if he erased people from his life as soon as he no longer needed them." Sophie fell silent, absorbing every detail. The image of Ethan as a powerful, impenetrable man was unraveling, replaced by something far darker. "Do you think he even remembers these people?" Sophie asked. Teresa scoffed. "If he does, he makes a point to ignore it. Ethan Bradford isn't someone who looks back." Sophie knew she needed to change that. She couldn't let her mother's story be forgotten. She thanked Teresa for the conversation and promised that she would make Ethan face what he had done. Back at her apartment, Sophie sat with the journal in hand. Each time she opened it, it felt like she was discovering something new, something that added layers to her mother's pain and sacrifices. But at that moment, while flipping through the worn pages, something different caught her attention. It was a thin envelope, hidden between two pages. Her mother's delicate handwriting was on the front, with the name Ethan written carefully. Sophie hesitated before opening it. What could her mother have written to him? And why had he never received this letter? With trembling fingers, she slid the paper out and began to read. Ethan, if you are reading this, it means you've already been through the worst. You made it, and I always knew you would. I never wanted recognition for what I did. I just wanted you to have a chance to achieve everything you were capable of achieving. You have talent, determination, and a vision that few possess. But now that you've reached this, I hope you remember one thing. You didn't get here alone. Many people believed in you, sacrificed for you. I hope that one day you look back and see this. I hope you use what you've gained to help others, just as so many people helped you. Sophie felt tears streaming down her face as she read. This was her mother, selfless, always thinking of others. Even after everything, Elizabeth had chosen to believe the best in Ethan, but Sophie couldn't ignore the pain her mother had endured, the neglect Ethan had shown over the years. She carefully placed the letter back in the envelope. This needed to be shown to Ethan. He had to hear not only her mother's words, but also the impact his actions, or lack thereof, had caused. The following days were spent preparing. Sophie knew she needed a moment when Ethan couldn't hide behind excuses or his position of power. She needed an audience. Ethan's upcoming birthday seemed like the perfect opportunity. He would be surrounded by influential people. Those same ones who idolized him and helped maintain his untouchable image. It was risky, and Sophie knew she could face consequences, but that wouldn't stop her. The night before the event, Sophie sat at the table with the journal and her mother's letter. She touched the worn cover reverently, feeling more connected to Elizabeth than ever. Finally, she took a deep breath and made her decision. "I'm going to do this, Mom," she said aloud, as if Elizabeth could hear her. "I'm going to make him remember." The main hall of the mansion was shrouded in a heavy silence. The constant murmur of the guests that had filled the space moments before had transformed into an expectant hush. All eyes were fixed on Sophie, who stood at the center of attention with unexpected strength. The microphone in her hand trembled slightly, but her voice was firm. She glanced at Ethan, who was standing next to the stage with his arms crossed, trying to maintain his composure. "My mother, Elizabeth Carter, worked in this house, in this company, with dedication and loyalty," Sophie began, her voice cutting through the air. She believed in Ethan. She believed in the man he could become. But what did she receive in return? The guests exchanged uncertain glances. Ethan moved as if he wanted to intervene, but hesitated. Sophie noticed and continued. "Let me tell you something about her story," she said, opening the diary and holding it firmly. She flipped through the pages until she found the entry she knew she needed to read. These are her words, written while she worked for you, Ethan. She took a deep breath before starting to read. "Today was another hard day. Ethan didn't say anything, but I saw in his eyes that he was close to giving up. He never asks for help, never admits weakness, but I knew I had to do something. If he failed, so many others would fail as well. I couldn't carry that weight on my conscience." Sophie lifted her eyes from the diary, staring at Ethan. He looked uncomfortable but still held a rigid posture. "These were my mother's words," Sophie said. "She saw the desperation in you, even if you never had the courage to admit it. And do you know what she did? She sacrificed herself." Ethan pressed his lips together, clearly struggling to contain a reaction. The guests, now fully absorbed, murmured amongst themselves, creating a wave of tension that spread through the hall. "She worked tirelessly," Sophie continued, "even when she was sick, even when she knew she should take care of herself. But she chose to care for you. She chose to save your company, even if it meant losing something she would never regain. Today I went to the doctor. He said I need to start treatment immediately, but how can I do that? Ethan needs me now more than ever. I can't abandon him. I hope this is worth it. I hope that one day he will use all of this for something greater." Sophie's voice faltered slightly as she read, but she quickly regained her composure. My mother believed that what she was doing was greater than herself. But what have you done, Ethan? What have you done when you succeeded? Did you even look back? Did you ever think of those who sacrificed everything so that you could be where you are today? Ethan's eyes flickered, but he didn't respond immediately. Finally, he stepped forward, his voice cold yet controlled. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't know your mother was sick. I didn't know what she was sacrificing." Sophie interrupted him, her voice filled with indignation. "You didn't know because you didn't want to know, Ethan. You never asked. You never cared enough to ask." The tension in the air mounted with every exchanged word. Some of the guests began to whisper, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but Sophie didn't care. She knew she was close to the crucial moment. "Do you think that's an excuse?" she continued. "Do you think saying I didn't know is enough? My mother died believing in you. She died hoping you would use your fortune and success to help others, just as she helped you." Ethan seemed to be battling something within himself. He moved a little closer, now almost beside Sophie. "I remember Elizabeth," he said, his voice softer. "She was an exceptional employee, someone I trusted. But I swear, Sophie, I never knew she was sick. I never knew she was sacrificing so much for me." Sophie shook her head, her frustration growing. "And you never asked, Ethan. You never looked at her as anything more than an employee. My mother believed you could be better, but you chose to forget. You chose to move on, as you always do." Sophie took a deep breath before continuing, knowing she was about to reveal the most devastating blow. "There's something else you need to know," she said, her voice now laden with emotion. She opened the diary once more, this time pulling out the letter hidden between the pages. "My mother wrote this for you. She never delivered it, but I think now is the time." She opened the envelope and began to read. "Ethan, if you're reading this, I hope you have already achieved what you so dearly desired. I hope you have used everything you've gained to do something meaningful, something that goes beyond yourself. Because if you don't do that, then all my sacrifice will have been in vain. I used my last paycheck to fund the campaign that saved your company. I used the money that should have gone towards my treatment. I did this because I believed in you. I believed you could be the kind of man who makes a difference in the world. ****. Please don't prove me wrong." Sophie lifted her eyes from the letter, tears streaming down her face. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan looked frozen, his face a mix of shock and guilt. "My mother sacrificed her own life to save you," Sophie said, her voice trembling but firm. "And you didn't even bother to honor that." Ethan took a step back, as if her words had struck him physically. He looked around, searching for some way to escape, but there was no way out. He was surrounded by his choices, his mistakes, and now a truth he could no longer ignore. The silence in the hall was broken by one of the guests, who began to clap slowly. Within seconds, the applause grew, echoing throughout the space. It wasn't applause for Ethan, but for Sophie, for the courage she had shown in exposing the truth. Ethan stood still, his eyes fixed on Sophie, as if he were finally seeing something that had been hidden in plain sight. Sophie didn't say anything more. She simply placed the diary and the letter on the nearest table, turned and left the hall. The sound of applause still echoed as she crossed the door, leaving Ethan alone to face the truth of his past. Thanks for staying with us through this journey. If you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like, leave a comment and subscribe. Your engagement helps us reach more people and share these powerful narratives. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The ballroom of the mansion, once a place of celebration and sophistication, had now become a stage for palpable tension. The bright lights illuminated Ethan's face, which seemed devoid of the confidence he had worn like armor. Sophie's words, sharp and painful, still echoed in the air as the guests exchanged uncertain glances and murmured among themselves. All eyes were on Ethan. He stood frozen as if the weight of the revelations had turned him to stone. Around him, the carefully constructed image of a successful and admired man was crumbling. And so, Ethan, a voice from one of the guests cut through the silence. It belonged to one of the company's oldest investors, whose expression was a mix of curiosity and reproach. What do you have to say about this? Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time in years, he didn't have the perfect words to regain control. It was as if every excuse or justification he could muster evaporated in the face of the undeniable truth Sophie had presented. Claire, standing in a corner, watched it all with a pale face. She was one of the few people who knew the darker layers of Ethan's story, but she had never witnessed anyone dare to challenge him so openly. Her eyes met Sophie's, and something shifted in her expression. Claire, who had always been loyal to Ethan, began to question her own position. Slowly walking over to Sophie, she pulled her aside. "Do you have anything else to prove this?" Claire whispered, not looking directly at the young woman. Sophie raised an eyebrow. "You mean besides the diary and the letter I just read, isn't that enough?" Claire hesitated before answering. "I may have something that could help. Documents that were filed away but never mentioned again. They could confirm what you're saying." Sophie felt a wave of mixed hope and caution. "And why would you help me now after all this time defending him?" Claire shrugged, looking at Ethan, who was still surrounded by the inquisitive gazes of the guests. "Because he needs to hear this. And maybe I need it too." With those words, Claire quickly left the room, disappearing down an adjacent hallway. As Claire searched for the documents, the pressure on Ethan continued to mount. A guest, a well-known journalist, crossed his arms and asked directly, "Ethan, why haven't we heard about Elizabeth Carter before? You've mentioned her as often as other important people in your career. Or did you choose to forget her?" The question felt like a direct punch. Ethan took a deep breath and finally found his voice. "It's not that I forgot," he began, his voice hoarse. Elizabeth was an important part of my team in the beginning, but I had no idea of the gravity of what she was facing." Sophie crossed her arms, her expression defiant. "You didn't know because you chose not to know. You were so focused on yourself that you never bothered to look at the people who helped you." Ethan turned to her, his composure beginning to crack. "I was young, Sophie. I was trying to save something I believed was bigger than any of us. I couldn't afford to waste time investigating every detail." "But you had time to enjoy the fruits of her labor, didn't you?" Sophie shot back, indignation evident in her voice. "You had time to become this business titan while she died without even a recognition." Before Ethan could respond, Claire returned with a thick envelope in hand. She walked up to Sophie and handed it to her, ignoring Ethan's surprised look. "What's this?" Sophie asked, carefully opening the envelope. "Financial reports and internal correspondence from that time," Claire said. "They clearly show how Elizabeth's money was used to save the company. They even include a letter from her to the finance department requesting that funds be allocated for the restructuring campaign." Sophie quickly skimmed through the documents, her eyes racing over the lines that confirmed everything she already knew, and more. She looked up at Ethan, whose features were now a mix of shock and defeat. "You knew," Sophie said, her voice as cold as ice. "You knew the money came from her. Maybe you didn't know about the illness, but you knew she was using everything she had to save you." Ethan shook his head, anger and guilt swirling in his expression. I didn't connect the dots. I didn't realize how far she was going." "You didn't realize because you never saw her as a person," Sophie said, her voice laden with emotion. "My mother believed in you, but you treated her like a disposable piece." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of paper being handled. Ethan picked up the letter from Elizabeth that Sophie had left on a nearby table. He held the paper with trembling hands and began to read aloud. "I hope you've achieved what you desired. Use everything you've gained to do something meaningful, something that goes beyond yourself." Ethan's voice faltered mid-reading. He stopped, blinking rapidly as the guests watched him in complete silence. When he tried to continue, his voice trembled, and he needed a moment to compose himself. "I never knew how much she believed in me," he finally said, more to himself than anyone else. "I never knew she sacrificed so much for me." Now you know, Sophie said firmly. What are you going to do about it? Ethan looked around, as if searching for an answer in the faces of the guests. But the only thing he found was the weight of his own choices. Finally, he collapsed into a nearby chair, cradling his head in his hands. I was wrong, he said, his voice broken. I was wrong with her, and I was wrong with so many others. I never thought about the consequences. I never looked back. The words were a beginning, but Sophie knew that it wasn't enough just to admit them. She stepped closer, her expression softening slightly. My mother didn't do what she did for you to feel guilty, she said. She did it because she believed you could be someone who made a difference. If you truly feel remorse, Ethan, then make it worthwhile. Sophie's words hung in the air as Ethan remained still, staring at the floor. The ballroom, once filled with voices and whispers, had now become a place of silent reflection. Claire approached slowly, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Maybe it's time to change, Ethan, she said softly. Maybe it's time to give back. Ethan raised his eyes, and for the first time that night there was something in them beyond arrogance or despair. There was understanding, and perhaps a spark of determination. The hall was enveloped in a heavy silence. The guests, once skeptical and murmuring among themselves, were now completely absorbed by the scene before them. Ethan sat with his head in his hands, while Sophie watched him with an expression that mixed pain and determination. Years of neglect, veiled suffering, and silenced memories were finally being exposed to the light. Ethan, Sophie began, her voice steady but devoid of the aggression she had shown earlier. This is no longer about what you didn't know or the excuses you might offer. It's about what you're going to do now. He slowly lifted his eyes, as if her words had hit him like a wave, leaving him disarmed. Ethan's gaze was unfocused, almost pleading, but Sophie did not look away. My mother believed in you more than she believed in herself, Sophie continued. She sacrificed everything she had, even the chance to fight for her own life, because she thought you were someone worth believing in. Do you know what that means? What kind of responsibility that places on you? Ethan straightened in his chair, but he seemed even smaller under the weight of her words. The hall felt colder, as if the guests' gazes froze the air around him. I don't know how to begin, he said, his voice hoarse. All of this, I can't. Start by honoring what she did, Sophie interrupted, her voice resolute. You built an empire on the sacrifices of her and so many others you chose to forget. Maybe it's time to remember not just that, but who you are and what you can do with everything you have. Ethan shook his head as if trying to rid himself of an invisible weight. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can. Fixing things isn't about making yourself feel better, Sophie said, moving closer. You do it because it's the right thing to do, because my mother believed you could be better than this. Prove her right. Claire, who had been watching in silence until now, stepped forward. She placed her hand on Ethan's shoulder, and when he looked at her, his face was calm but firm. You've always been good with words, Ethan, Claire said. But maybe now is the time to act. If not for Elizabeth, then at least for yourself. Ethan glanced back at Sophie. What do you want me to do? He asked, with a sincerity that was new to him, something raw and vulnerable. Sophie took a deep breath. Change. Start by recognizing what's been done for you. Stop building walls around yourself and see the people who helped you get where you are. Use what you have to do something that honors her sacrifice and those of others. Ethan slowly stood up, running a hand over his face as if he wanted to wipe away the mask he had worn for years. He turned to the guests, still hesitant but resolved. Let all of you be witnesses, he began, his voice stronger than he expected. For years, I built my life and my career on the idea that I was self-sufficient, that everything I achieved was solely the result of my own effort. Today, I realize how wrong that was. The murmurs intensified for a moment, but Ethan raised his hand to silence the crowd. Elizabeth Carter was one of the most important people in the early days of my career, and I failed to recognize that. I failed to see what she sacrificed for me. Therefore, I want to promise that things will change. Ethan looked at Sophie again before continuing. "I will use every resource I have to make a difference, not just for myself, but for the people who helped me get here. This starts today." The hall fell silent again, but this time there was no tension. It was something lighter, almost a feeling of hope. The guests exchanged glances, clearly impacted by the declaration. One by one, they began to applaud, tentatively at first, but soon the sound filled the hall. Ethan turned to Sophie, his eyes brimming with tears. "I know words aren't enough," he said, "but I hope this is a start." Sophie remained silent for a moment, allowing the intensity of the moment to dissipate slightly. Then, she extended her mother's diary to Ethan. "This is all that's left of her," Sophie said, her voice trembling slightly. "Every thought, every sacrifice, every hope she had is here. Don't waste it." Ethan took the diary with trembling hands, holding it as if it were made of glass. He looked at the cover, at the wear on the edges, and seemed to see something he had never noticed before. His shoulders slumped under the weight of everything that small object represented. "I promise," he said, with a sincerity that needed no further explanation. "I promise I won't waste it." Sophie nodded, finally allowing her own tears to fall. She stepped back, leaving Ethan with the diary in hand and the opportunity to do what was right. The chapter ends with Ethan looking at the diary, the pages beginning to open in his hands, while the guests continue to applaud. He finally understands that true success is not what he has built, but what he can do with it from now on. The days following Ethan's birthday brought a palpable transformation in his life and actions. The mansion, once a symbol of his wealth and power, had become a space for reflection. The main hall, which had witnessed Sophie's devastating revelations, was now where Ethan drafted plans, made calls, and began to build something he had never imagined before. A true legacy grounded in justice and gratitude. Sophie, for her part, kept her distance. She no longer sought confrontation or oversight. What she wanted had already been planted, the seed of change. The rest would be his choice. On the third day after the party, Ethan called a press conference to announce his first concrete action. The conference room of his company was packed with journalists, eager to know if the rumors were true. The flashes of cameras captured his every movement as he positioned himself behind the podium. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice calm but laden with emotion. "In the past few days, I've had the opportunity to reflect deeply on my life and my choices. It's difficult to admit, but for many years I lived believing that success justified everything, that the means didn't matter as long as the outcome was grand. Today I know how wrong that was." Murmurs filled the room, but he pressed on. "I want to start by announcing the creation of the Elizabeth Carter Fund, in honor of the woman who made an unimaginable sacrifice so I could succeed. This fund will be dedicated to supporting workers and their families, ensuring that no effort goes unnoticed and no one is left behind." Sophie watched the press conference from home, sitting on the small sofa in her living room. The TV captured Ethan's serious and remorseful face. It felt strange to see him this way, so vulnerable, so human. For a moment, she wondered if her mother would be proud. Ethan's announcements didn't stop there. In addition to the fund, he promised to implement internal changes in his company, creating recognition and support programs for his employees. He wasn't just talking, he was acting. Claire, now closer to Ethan than ever, helped coordinate these efforts. She reached out to former colleagues, partners, and even competitors, trying to involve as many people as possible in the project. But Ethan's biggest challenge was still ahead. "Are you sure about this, sir?" Claire asked as they walked toward the car. She held a folder with the names and addresses of former employees of Ethan, many of whom had been harmed by decisions he made in the past. "Absolutely," he replied with a determination that felt renewed. "I owe this to them, to all of them." The first visit was to a man named Arthur, who had been fired under questionable circumstances years ago. Ethan stopped in front of a modest house in the suburbs, his hands sweating slightly. Arthur opened the door, his expression surprised to see Ethan standing there. "Mr. Chambers," he said, his voice heavy with distrust, "what brings you here?" "Arthur," Ethan began, his voice firm but filled with humility. "I came to apologize, and if possible, to try to make things right." Arthur narrowed his eyes, crossing his arms. "Make things right? After all these years, do you think words are enough?" "No," Ethan admitted. "Words will never be enough, but I hope they can be a start." Ethan explained how he planned to compensate Arthur and other harmed employees, offering not just financial support, but also job opportunities and inclusion in the new projects his company was developing. Arthur listened in silence, and in the end, he simply nodded, still skeptical but perhaps a little less bitter. The visits continued in the following days. Ethan faced glares of anger, harsh words, and even slammed doors. But he also found acceptance, albeit hesitant on some occasions. One of the most emotional visits was to the house of a former employee named Marla, who had been Elizabeth's assistant. When Ethan mentioned Elizabeth's name, Marla broke down in tears, sharing memories of the woman who had been a maternal figure to many in the company. "She believed in you," Marla said, wiping away her tears, "even when we didn't. I hope you live up to that, Ethan." As Ethan traversed his path of redemption, Sophie was also making progress in her own journey. She decided to visit her mother's grave, something she had avoided for years. With the journal in hand, she knelt before the simple tombstone, which bore only the name Elizabeth Carter. Sophie opened the journal, running her fingers over the pages filled with her mother's words, feeling a connection between them like never before. "I did what you wanted, Mom," she said softly. "I made him listen, and I think he's changing." The wind gently blew, as if responding to Sophie. She closed the journal, feeling a peace she hadn't known since losing her mother. When she stood up, she felt it was time to move on, but not to forget. She decided she would use her newfound strength to continue her mother's legacy, perhaps not alongside Ethan, but on her own path. In the following days, Sophie began to plan her own initiative, inspired by the fund created by Ethan, but with a more personal reach. She wanted to help young people who, like her, had been underestimated and marginalized. "Are you sure about this?" a friend asked as Sophie discussed her plans. "Absolutely," she replied, smiling. "My mom always believed in the power of people, and I think it's time to do the same." As Ethan confronted the ghosts of his past, and Sophie embraced a promising future, their paths began to diverge, but in a way that felt natural, almost inevitable. They had played their roles in each other's lives, and now it was time for each to move forward. What remained between them was not anger but respect, and in a way a connection that no words could fully describe. The chapter ends with Sophie looking toward the horizon of her new life, and Ethan holding Elizabeth's journal, still reading and absorbing each word as a lesson. Both, in different ways, were finally reconstructing their paths. The auditorium was bathed in soft lights, and every detail of the environment felt charged with meaning. A large banner hung against the back wall displaying the words, "Elizabeth Carter Program, Dignity and Opportunities." The name was an undeniable tribute, powerful and moving, reflecting the sacrifice of a woman who had shaped lives even in the absence of acknowledgement. The front row was occupied by former employees, new beneficiaries of the fund, and journalists who were closely following the event. In the center of the stage, Ethan Chambers awaited his turn to speak. He held the microphone as if it were a heavy weight. His hands trembled slightly, but his expression remained resolute. Sophie sat among the honored guests. She wore a simple yet elegant dress that contrasted with the grandeur of the event. As she observed the audience, she felt a mix of emotions, relief, nostalgia, and above all, a sense that the cycle was closing. Ethan walked to the center of the stage, his steps deliberate. When he began to speak, his voice didn't sound like that of a magnate accustomed to addressing crowds. It was the voice of a man who had been broken and rebuilt. "Good evening, everyone," he said, pausing to look at each face in the audience. "We are here today to inaugurate something that I hope will become a legacy. The Elizabeth Carter Program is not just a pretty name. It is a reminder of the sacrifice of a woman who was fundamental in my journey, but whose impact I only came to understand recently. The audience was in complete silence. The mention of Elizabeth's name brought tears to the eyes of some, especially among those who had known her. Elizabeth was not just an employee, Ethan continued. She was a person who believed in values that for many years I ignored. Her sacrifice was not only financial, it was a sacrifice of spirit, health, and life. And it is my responsibility, as someone who benefited from that, to ensure that her memory is never forgotten. Ethan's words, so different from the man Sophie had confronted days earlier, were met with a resounding applause. The event continued with presentations from initial beneficiaries of the program, heartfelt stories of workers who would receive educational, financial, and psychological support to transform their lives. Sophie watched everything closely. Each story seemed to reflect, in some way, the silent struggle her mother had faced. When the Master of Ceremonies announced that Sophie would be the next speaker, a profound silence enveloped the auditorium. Sophie stepped onto the stage with hesitant steps, holding an envelope with notes she had prepared. When she reached the microphone, the light blinded her momentarily, but seeing the audience made her feel strong. "Good evening," she began, her voice calm. "When I was invited to speak today, I thought of many things I could say. I thought about how I could describe my mother, Elizabeth Carter, in a way that all of you could understand her impact." She paused, locking eyes with the crowd. "But I realized that the best way to honor her is not just to talk about what she did, but what she represents." The emotion in her voice was evident, but Sophie remained composed. "My mother was an ordinary woman. She worked long hours, cared for me, and still found time to help others. But what made her special was her ability to believe in people. Even when she herself needed help, she found the strength to give. And that belief, that strength, is what brought me here today." Her words seemed to resonate in the room. Sophie didn't read any of the notes she had prepared. Instead, she spoke from the heart, each word filled with sincerity. "Today, we are here to celebrate a program that bears her name. But I want everyone to remember that her sacrifice, just like that of so many others who are not known, will only be truly honored if we continue to fight for dignity and opportunity for all." She paused, her eyes turning to Ethan, who was seated in the front row. "My mother believed in you, Ethan," she said, her voice growing firmer. "And now I believe that you can live up to that faith. I hope this program is just the beginning." The applause was deafening. Ethan stood visibly moved and applauded along with the audience. Sophie left the stage, her heart racing, but with a sense of mission accomplished. After the speeches, the most symbolic moment of the event was announced: the inauguration of a memorial in honor of Elizabeth Carter. At the center of the stage, a lit display case was revealed. Inside lay Elizabeth's diary, open to a carefully chosen page. Ethan was called to the stage to unveil it. He approached the display case, looking at the diary with a mix of reverence and regret. "This diary," he began, "contains the words of a woman whose strength I never fully understood until now. But it is not just a record of the past. It is a reminder of what we can do for the future." He turned to Sophie, who was standing at the side of the stage. "Sophie, this diary has always been the heart of this story, and I want you to know that it will be here as a symbol of sacrifice, hope, and transformation, so that no one ever forgets what your mother represented." The guests stood in applause as Ethan placed the glass cover over the display case, sealing the diary in its place. Later, as the guests began to leave, Sophie remained in the auditorium for a few moments, gazing at the memorial. Claire approached her, smiling. "You did something incredible here today," Claire said. Sophie nodded. "I didn't do it alone, but I think my mom can finally rest in peace." As Ethan approached, Sophie looked at him with an expression that was no longer distrustful but accepting. "Thank you for everything," he said, his voice heavy with sincerity. Sophie responded with a small smile. "Now it's up to you, Ethan. Don't waste what has been given to you." She walked away, leaving the auditorium with the feeling that at last she had done her part. Outside, the wind was fresh and Sophie took a deep breath, feeling a lightness she hadn't known in a long time. Elizabeth Carter had been honored, not only by the memorial but by the changes that were to come. And for the first time in years, Sophie felt ready to move forward. The stories of Sophie and Ethan remind us that the mistakes of the past don't have to define the future. Elizabeth's sacrifice and the journey of reconciliation show us the strength of forgiveness, the courage to face the truth, and the transformative power of honoring those we love. This narrative is not just about justice or redemption, but about how our actions can impact generations. While Ethan finds purpose in making amends, Sophie realizes that her mother's memory will live on forever in the hearts of those she touched. Now I ask you, what sacrifices in your life deserve to be honored? How can we transform the pain of the past into something meaningful? And of course, what did you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. They mean so much to us. If you enjoyed this heartfelt story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapters of stories that touch the heart. Your engagement makes all the difference. And don't stop here. Click on the end screen card to watch the next recommended video. I'm sure you'll love it. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. See you next time.